But tonight, we're finally glad to get to the main event, which is Ann Masury, Ann Mankin Masury, who is our speaker. She has a master's degree in plant science from the University of Connecticut. She completed a program in historic landscape restoration. She worked for many years at Strawbery Banke in the ancient days when I was there. And she also worked at Historic New England, and she has her own business, which is Fletcher Hill Gardens. And she lives in Kittery Point, Maine, and she's going to tell us about a Kittery landmark, the Lady Pepperrell House and Gardens. So please welcome Ann.
Thank you, Tom. We'll make sure. Can everyone hear in the back? Good. All right. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the Lady Pepperrell House and Gardens in particular, but a little bit more about some of the other family gardens that are located in Kittery Point, the William Pepperrell House and Gardens, the Sparhawk House as well. This project got started a few years ago when the current owners of the Lady Pepperrell House had requested that I do a cultural landscape report to document the changes that had taken place at the gardens over the years. And I was very surprised to realize that no one had done something like that before, given the significance of the house itself and how much was left of the gardens. And so the research that I'm presenting tonight is part of that report, and then I'm tying in some things that were part of my past studies of Portsmouth fence styles, some of the other architectural features like summer houses, and tying that into what we'll see tonight. So the cultural landscape report was done in 2023, and Earl Shuttleworth, the director of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, calls the Lady Pepperrell House one of the most high-style pre-revolutionary Georgian houses in Maine. The current owners, as I said, contacted me several years ago to do the report. I wanted to thank the Athenaeum for inviting me and providing such an important facility for researchers like myself. The focus, as I said, will be on the landscape and gardens of this, and then tying in some of the other family gardens. From the Old Kittery and Her Family's publication by Everett Stackpole is this map that depicts the 1650 to 1700 time period. It was done in 1903, and what to note, we might look up in the corner, in this corner, where you see the name Gunnison and the church, which is part of some of the back in the 1600s, will tie into the Pepperrell property, which ends up the Lady Pepperrell House being right over here. Right across the street was the first parish church, which was built in 1730, and the cemetery at about the same time. On the map, we can also see Fort William, which was named after, in this area, for Colonel William Pepperrell, and his house from 1682 and the Bray House from 1662. So they're down in this area, John Bray, and then the Pepperrell House. So a little bit farther along Pepperrell Road, and then of course this is the water right here. Today's view of those properties, this would have been in the complex now that is the modern complex of buildings, but the older building remains here, and then the William Pepperrell House is still on the corner of Pepperrell Road and Bellamy Lane. Colonel Pepperrell built in 1682 on the land from his father-in-law, Bray. Several children were born, and Sir William, born in 1696. He would marry Mary Hurst from Boston in 1723. Bray was Colonel Pepperrell's father-in-law because he married his daughter Marjorie. Just so a very close location between the two properties. The Pepperrells, father and son, were the largest merchants on the Piscataqua River, and perhaps in New England, until the start of the American Revolution. Lumber and ship timber floated down the river in gondolas from the head of the tidewaters, and fish from the Grand Banks and the Isles of Shoals poured into their waterfront warehouses. Their cargoes were sent to the West Indies, to Portugal, the Mediterranean, and England in exchange for goods coming back to the Piscataqua region. Often their vessels and cargo were sold together, promoting the extension of a successful shipbuilding industry in their boatyards and the chief source of their wealth. Their monetary gains were invested in real estate and purchased at low prices, and rapidly increased in value as the nearby port of Portsmouth was growing. This is a portrait of William Pepperrell, a portly gentleman, done in 1746 by Smibert. William's father would die in 1734, and he expands the house in Kittery Point. He's the first American to be crowned a British baronet and the first to serve as general in the British Royal Army. These titles were awarded after he led the 1745 capture of the French fortress of Louisbourg during the King George War. We're looking at 3 views of the Pepperrell House, all 19th century views. Following his father's death in 1734, he enlarged the house by adding 15-foot L's on either end, making it 75 feet long. He added 2 chimneys, Lutheran windows on the south side, changing the roof to a curb roof. Moses Safford writes in 1893 in his article, Historic Homes of Kittery, about the Pepperrell landscape. Outside, a paved walk of cobblestones extended around the house and led to the barge landing directly in front, at the lower end of which were large dressed stone steps. Also, a wharf and 4 stores were constructed, and from London, a family tomb was placed across the house up on a rise. He enclosed a park on the west of the way, leading to the wharf with a wall 6 feet high, which was surmounted with a picket board fence. A wall of corresponding height on the other side kept moose, deer, and a variety of game. The tomb was built in the front center of the great orchard, which was planted with apple and pear trees. Under the Confiscation Act of 1778, the mansion house was sold. Major Thomas Cutts would buy it in 1790 and operate it as a tavern. It was he that set out the elm trees, whose majestic presence has served so long to decorate the grounds and lend an air of grandeur to the place, many of which are now standing. So only the view on the bottom shows some of the walls, and we don't see any picket fence on top of them. The elms are there, and that's their classic vase shape. So those come from a later time period, the 1790s. This view hardly shows really the water in front, but these 2 You can see a little sailboat there and schooner out in front of the house. It's quite close, but the topography sends it down towards the water, which is difficult to ascertain from these views. The tomb is up on the north side of the property, and so we're looking down on what used to be Frisbee's Market, and the harbor is down here. So the tomb is actually still there, in just above the parking lot to the bistro and Pepperrell Cove restaurant conglomerate. So it sits up there, and then just behind it was the Pepperrell Hotel. It was inscribed on the top, and the family coat of arms had 3 pineapples. Later, they would add his crest to this area up here, but originally it just had the 3 pineapples on the family coat of arms. A portrait of Benning Wentworth that was done by Joseph Blackburn in 1760. He was appointed royal governor in 1741. When Sir William returned from Boston in triumphal procession following the Louisburg victory, he was entertained at Governor Wentworth's house in Little Harbor. He was rowed across the Piscataqua to Pepperrell Mansion in the royal governor's barge. Later, it's said that Sir William himself acquired his own barge. A letter exists here at the Athenaeum from Pepperrell, from Benning Wentworth, thanking Pepperrell for a gift of venison. So remember, he had his deer park, so we're thinking he harvested locally. This is an image of the Piscataqua, and if you're thinking of him rowing the barge, we can see Pepperrell Cove here, and he would be coming all the way across here to Little Harbor. A more modern view of the Benning Wentworth mansion, but you can see its close proximity to the water. And then a detail of a plan of the Piscataqua Harbor that was done by James Grant in 1774. And the Wentworth property was included in this, and it's located right here. So buildings up in this area were depicted in red. The ornamental garden in this area, and right in the center is a circular red dot that you can't see that well in this image, but it's there. You came down Little Harbor Road to access the property, and you can see how close it is to the water. So the dot itself, the scale of which maybe doesn't work for a summer house, but very likely that that's what it was in the center of the garden. A later plan was done in 1812 by Hale, and you can see a similar layout. House, there's the key indicates that this area right here was a flower garden and yard right next to the house. And then there were orchards. There were some commercial aspects to it with a store and wharf, but a similar, very extensive garden on the property. William Pepperrell erected a house for his daughter Elizabeth upon her marriage to Nathaniel Sparhawk in 1742. Safford is again the writer in 1893 as he describes the Sparhawk house. It's 60 feet long, 34 feet wide, and 2 stories high, with a curved roof, which, by the way, when they talk about Lutheran windows and curved roof, I'm not an architect, but is that a gambrel roof and dormer windows? Yes, okay. so I wasn't too wrong. The present cupola is a modern addition by the present occupant, who was Mrs. Jane Brown, who was an Englishwoman. The site of this house is very beautiful, being in the center of a fine tract of about 20 acres of land near the junction of Spruce and Barters Creek. It's approached from the street near the village church through an avenue of noble trees over a finely graded driveway. Besides ornamental trees, the grounds contained a great variety of fruit trees with all the variety of nut trees that grew in this climate. There was a fine summer house east of the dwelling, standing about midway between it and the creek, as late as 50 years ago. Another writer in 1877 said that the house front is shaded by leafy lindens. And if we look at the door detail with the bullseye glass above, you can see the level of sophistication this house had. The Architectural Review from 1918 captures a feature, the later feature, of a newel post that had a carved pineapple. You can see it right there, and it was actually done by John Bellamy. So remember, the pineapple was part of the coat of arms, and maybe that's where the inspiration from that came from. But there it is at the base of the stairwell. In looking at this view of the Sparhawk mansion, we can see two of the trees that were mentioned. One, both of them have classic shapes. So the Lombardy poplar, which is this one, very tall and narrow and columnar. And then the linden, broad, pyramidal in shape. That was the shade tree that was in front of the house. Now, Charles Brewster, which many of you are familiar with his rambles about Portsmouth, which was done in 1869, he was the editor of the Portsmouth Journal and included a chapter on trees, 3 generations of trees. He says more than 20 years elapsed after the Revolution before there was any systematic effort made for planting ornamental trees in our streets. In 1793, Governor Langdon introduced the first Lombardy poplars and put them in front of his residence. They were so thrifty and elegant that they became very popular with the public. And not only did they find a place in front yards, but the citizens were stirred up to give them place in all of our most public streets. Those trees were purchased probably in Boston. Those were then followed by the sycamore or buttonwood tree. But within 10 years, they met their demise because of the abundance of caterpillars that would drop down on pedestrians' heads as they were walking in the streets. Those were then followed by elms, and we know what happened with the elms, and then by maples. It showcases the dangers of monoplanting a single species. When diseases like the Dutch elm hit, all were wiped out. And now we're experiencing this with the ash trees, with emerald ash borers. In every small town, you can see tree companies now just eliminating so many of the street trees. So perhaps we haven't learned our lesson. This is a nursery that was located in New York, the William Prince Nursery, a very famous nursery. And the image is from 1790. And the variety of plant material that they offered was pretty remarkable. Plums, apricots, peaches, figs, nectarines, apples, pears, cherries, mulberries, raspberries, strawberries, roses, currants, quince, evergreens, flowering shrubs, and timber trees. This is a view of Sparhawk Lane from today. And if you look down the street, you'll see the fence in front of the Lady Pepperrell House. So it's literally a hop, skip, and a jump right down the street. They're in very, very close proximity. The Lady Pepperrell House was built following the death of Sir William in 1759. It wasn't built in 1759, but his death was in 1759 on just 1 acre of land. So a very different property than, remember, the 20 acres at Sparhawk Hall. The cemetery is just down below, which was across from the street, and you can see the grade of the house sitting up on the rise and gradually going down where it would meet the water below. Lady Pepperrell chose her location to be as close as she could to her daughter Elizabeth at Sparhawk Hall and her church across the street. The church originally was the first parish church and faced west to the Lady Pepperrell. Later, it was moved back from the road in 1874 to face south, which is its current orientation. The steeple was removed for a cupola. Mary Hurst, Lady Pepperrell, was described by a 19th century biographer as a woman of superior abilities, witty, highly cultivated, conversant with the best English authors of her day, and possessing much poetical genius, having written a column of poetry. He goes on to say she was one of the old school and devotedly attached to her husband and children. Her figure was of medium height, well-formed and graceful. She had an intelligent countenance, fine eyes, and beautiful hands. Moses Safford again writes of the Lady Pepperrell House, the house was erected by Lady Pepperrell after the death of her husband and stands very near the church and very near where Kittery Point touches Spruce Creek and the Piscataqua, and near that of her daughter Sparhawk. The site is a commanding one. Being the latest built of the houses of this family, its exterior and interior represent a more modern style of workmanship. Though the personal influence of her friends, Lady Pepperrell was saved from the operation of the Confiscation Act. She survived her husband 30 years and died in the house in 1789. Again, Stackpole and Old Kittery and her families from 1903, and this representing 1775. So Sir William's house is still right here. We see the Pepperrell tomb included, the great orchard in this area, Sparhawk's property in this area. The church is included. But curiously, there is no Lady Pepperrell House there, indicated on the map. And does it have something to do with the Revolution? I don't know. Here is where Fort William, and eventually it would be renamed to Fort McCleary, is located. This is a watercolor from Albert Fisk. It's from 1842, but it probably has the most valid depiction of what the landscape looked like in the 18th century. So the house up above, a number of outbuildings, all enclosed by board fences. The front fence more formal, paneled, two-toned. Probably a wood house, a hen house as well. There's some question to the precise date of the construction of the Pepperrell House. Frederick Porter writes in a survey of existing colonial architecture in 1918 that the period of construction was from 1760 to 65, which length of time may be accounted for by a legend told me by the present owner, who would have been one of the Cutts, to the effect that no local workmen of skill being available, Lady Pepperrell brought 2 carpenters from England, who were the only workmen on the building. There is a story that the woodwork and carving were also brought from England, but this I was unable to verify. But then we have this notice in the New Hampshire Gazette. It was published in 1762 in April. We hear from Kittery that last Thursday, a house belonging to my Lady Pepperrell of that place took fire and was entirely consumed. But the second notice on the same page makes a notation that the house took fire and burnt to the ground. This is another house in Newington. So they make the distinction that it burnt to the ground, whereas on Lady Pepperrell it says it was entirely consumed. So maybe damaged extensively and rebuilt after 1762, and that's why it gives it the end date of 1765 as the construction period. The property below Lady Pepperrell was the Piggin House. It later would go to the Garish family. And below is the Pepperrell Warehouse, which dates from 1710. It was part of William Pepperrell's estate until after the Revolutionary War. It was confiscated by the state of Massachusetts and later bought by Samuel Smallcorn in 1778, but was included in the purchase by Joseph Cutts. It was sold eventually to Follett and then to Garish. The warehouse actually survived to 1970, when it was going to be transferred to the Maine Maritime Museum, but fell apart in the process. Lady Pepperrell's valuation in 1760 stood at £110. Her son-in-law, Sparhawk, had the same valuation. Both properties far exceeded the values of other nearby real estate in Kittery's first parish, most of which were assessed between £2 and £12. The parsonage to the first parish church dates to 1729. Across the street from the Lady Pepperrell House, there's a description of the gardens that came from a 19th century novelist from York, Maine, Madam Woods. Born in 1759, she wrote several novels and a few letters known as Recollections of Madam Woods. She wrote them for various younger relatives to answer some of their questions. She writes in the 1840s, and at this point she's in her 80s. But she included a number of key descriptions of Kittery Gardens from the 18th century. Of the parsonage at Kittery Point, a small, neat, and fanciful yard. The court in front opened upon a garden where flowers, fruits, vegetables, and box were arranged in such a charming and regular manner that it rather had the appearance of an ornamental rather than a useful spot. From it, we had a view of Newcastle, part of Kittery, Rye, and Portsmouth. William Whipple, signer of the Declaration of Independence, was born here at the Whipple Garrison. This restored modern view exists today down by the second entrance to the Portsmouth Navy Yard, or Kittery Navy Yard. Madam Woods visited Madam Whipple as a young girl, accompanied by her mother. She describes the garden. You may walk into the garden and see the summer house. The lady built it, and remember that the currant bushes, the roses and the tulips, are the descendants of those she brought from Old England and first planted in this province. Although thousands of seeds and roots have been taken from them, there's still a multitude remaining. She goes on to say, I had never seen anything so beautiful as that garden. Such a profusion of currants, gooseberries, fancy violets, roses and tulips were surely never collected in so small a space. The summer house was literally worn out and covered with moss. The ruins were propped up with posts. Now we'll look at a few other 18th century gardens, some local and not local examples that may have similarities to the Pepperrell family houses and their gardens. This a detail from the southwest prospect of the seat of Colonel George Boyd from 1774, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. A very ornamental garden, enclosed in front of the house, ornamental in appearance. The paths were probably lined with boxwood. You can see a low shrub-like plant there. All the paths form and go to a central water feature, which is enclosed, a pool. The outbuilding that's in the upper corner could have been a summer house. It's said that the front fence, the posts were surmounted by carved grenadier heads. And the fence paint colors were delineated. You can see on the side the red, which was a more utilitarian color, and then the white, more formal fence in the front. The Wentworth Gardner House here in Portsmouth was also built in 1760, and a garden plan from 1798 depicts the house as it's including a little bit of commercial aspects to it. It had a store, a wharf on the front side that bordered the water side. In the back was the garden, and they even include the necessary, which is right there, which is the privy. Over the door was a carved pineapple. This, the Sheaf Summer House, that was depicted in Sarah Foster's book of watercolors, her sketches around Portsmouth and the seacoast area from 1896, but it's an earlier summer house, and you can see how it's been built up on this rock outcropping. It's one story, somewhat elaborate, with a view out to the water. And this was located just very close to Benning Wentworth's estate in Little Harbor. Another view from the late 18th century, this from the artist Ralph Earl, houses fronting New Milford Green from 1796. An ornamental fence with carved urns in the front, a side garden, and in the back, clearly, a small summer house. The portrait of William Paca of Maryland, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. This was done by Charles Wilson Peale in 1772, and included in the background is his summer house. This, a very elaborate two-story house, begins to show us the extent of workmanship that went into these buildings. They were another room removed from the house. It was utilized for gaming, I'm sure drinking, gathering of men. They were wainscoted and plastered with finished floors. Very different from the later 19th century summer houses that we would see in gardens that encouraged the interaction with people and nature. So these buildings were really quite remarkable. And we see three more examples. The one on the left from the Isaac Royal estate, which has some connections to the Pepperrell family, in that William Pepperrell's heir, also named William, married the daughter, Elizabeth of Isaac Royal. But it's a summer house that's been documented in a number of places, and it's octagonal in design with big arched windows, and had a flying Mercury weather vane capping the cupola. The next example is a little more simple one-story design in Bristol, Rhode Island. And then finally, uh, the very elaborate Derby summer house that was carved by Samuel McIntyre of Salem. And you can see the details of the workmanship certainly equal to those that went into the house. The craftsmanship that we see extended to the fences associated with these 18th century high-style houses and their gardens. Many of the same skilled joiners were hired to provide the working details for the house. They were the same that were constructing the fences that fronted them. Inspiration came from architectural pattern books, both American and English. This from Asher Benjamin's Country Builder's Assistant from 1797, a design for urns, and the lower, both of these are very much like well, you probably don't notice, but the one at the Moffat Ladd House is actually very, very similar to those two. And then we have a plate for gate designs that came from an English pattern book by J. Miller in 1743. As we look at this map from 1856, the Lady Pepperrell House is up in this area. We see Garish now below in the Pillow House, but it says T. Cutts, and remember T. Cutts was Thomas Cutts that bought the William Pepperrell House, and during this period of ownership, the Cutts family would be there, but not Thomas. It was still Joseph Cutts, so another mystery. Sometimes I think it's subscribers that get their names put on these maps if they pay. And so perhaps Thomas slipped a bill and was slipped into the Lady Pepperrell spot. Sparhawk is operated by the Penhallow family right here, who were from Portsmouth. And then in this map from 1872, we have Lady Pepperrell listed, and then Miss S. Cutts. So that is Sally Cutts. Following the death of Lady Pepperrell in 1789, she would leave the property to her daughter, Elizabeth, who was married to Nathaniel Sparhawk. And then it was bought by Daniel Humphreys, who was the family lawyer and was also married to Elizabeth's daughter, Catherine. They would sell to Joseph Cutts in 1800, and it would stay in the extended Cutts family until 1922. Like the Pepperrell family, the Cutts family had built a prosperous life in Kittery Point in the 18th century. Joseph Cutts purchased the house for $1,000 with its outbuildings, and like Pepperrell, he made his fortunes in the shipment and trading of goods. However, Jefferson's trade embargo and the War of 1812 ceased all shipping trade with England, and it devastated Cutts' finances, which never recovered. Cutts remained in the house until his death in 1861. His daughter Sally, who had cared for him and his two sons, remained in the house until almost her death in 1874. Racked by not only financial ruin, but devastating mental illness, their life in the house was difficult, and the house and property fell into gradual decline. Both of her brothers died, one by suicide. Her father had mental illness, and she eventually would also uh, be devastated by it. Samuel Drake writes in 1874, in order to understand what a New England village was like a century ago, one should visit Kittery Point. There's a stark contrast to the enterprising days of bustling commerce and fortunes made, and an appreciation now for ancient houses and the transition to an area attracting tourists. Many a writer documented the sad decline of the Pepperrell House and its sole occupant, Sally Cutts. We get a glimpse in James Head's account in 1866 of a visit to the Cutts house, as he mentions the landscape. As I gazed out of the west window upon the river that glided so beautifully by, as it did in years of yore, when the old house looked down upon it in its bright days, and upon the garden now neglected and dismal, and upon the shaded arbors and rustic summer house, falling to decay, my thoughts went back 100 years, when officers of the king and ladies strolled through the grounds, followed by servants and waiting maids. The grounds are enclosed with a paneled fence with high and massive monumental posts, which when first erected must have made a grand appearance. The posts are now going to decay, and the fence is slowly dropping to the ground. Sarah Orne Jewett wrote a book called Deep Haven in 1877, and in it was an essay called Miss Chauncey. She refers to Sally Cutts, whose given name was Sarah Chauncey Cutts. As we left the church, we walked along the road and came in sight of a fine old house, which had fallen into ruin years before. The front entrance was a fine specimen of old-fashioned workmanship, with its columns and carvings, and the fence had been a grand affair in its day. The long range of outbuildings were falling piece by piece. One shed had been blown down entirely. We noticed the gnarled lilacs in the yard, the wrinkled cinnamon roses, and a flourishing company of French pinks, or bouncing beds. In describing Sally, she's been alone for many years, and no one can persuade her to leave the old house, where she seems contented. She had no idea of the poverty of her surroundings when she paced back and forth on the ruined terraces of her garden. The ranks of lilies and the conserve roses were still in bloom for her, and the box borders were as trimly kept as ever. Sally would die in 1874. We first hear of Oliver Cutts purchasing the Lady Pepperrell House in the Portsmouth Journal in 1874, the year Sally dies. Oliver Cutts, having sold his lumber yard at Kittery Foreside, has returned to his old home at Kittery Point. He's now occupying a portion of the Congregational parsonage while repairing the Sally Cutts house. Mr. Cutt is having the house very thoroughly repaired, preserving, restoring all of its rich and grand old style of architecture. And when well and newly painted throughout and otherwise complete, it will look as good as new. Mr. Cutts will probably make it his future residence. Even the Boston publication, the Boston Evening Transcript, picked up on the news in 1877, noting Oliver Cutts's work. The old and historic mansion house at Kittery Point, which was erected for Lady Pepperrell following the death of her husband in 1759, has recently come into the possession of Oliver Cutts of that place. Mr. Cutts has caused it to be thoroughly repaired and put in complete condition, and it's now one of the most attractive and desirable residences on the coast of Maine. We're going to look at the house in the late 19th century, the next three views of the front view. And as you look through the fence, can you see what's on the right-hand side? What is it? It's a dory. It's a boat. See it? So is it a 19th century planter? I don't know. I don't know. Why would you have a dory in your front yard? I'm not really sure, but this is 1890. The windows have changed to 2/2, and Earl Shuttleworth notes that it was Oliver Cutts that was probably responsible for that change. And then look at this sweet glider. Now, it's dated here as 1904, and this was a slide from the Colonial Dames slideshow from this time period, but in fact, there's a dating right here is the kitchen addition. And around 1900, there was an addition, a second-story addition that took place. And so this would have to be pre-1900, this view. And in this third, we have a hammock right in the front yard. So 3 different treatments in the front yard. They certainly were using their, and then a view to the backyard where the well is here, and then the old barn. But again, it still has to be before 1900. William Barry lived in Kennebunk, Maine, and he worked in Boston as a draftsman. He would write a book called Pen Sketches of Old Houses in 1874. And this is a sketch from 1883 showing the Lady Pepperrell House and a patterned front walk, which is what I was interested in. Below in the caption, it says, "The front yard walk laid in small pebble designs." And you can see the cross-hatching, and those that have been to the Lady Pepperrell House know that there's still a beach stone walk there today. But the windows are curious because it's 1883. There's still the Cutts family there. We know that Oliver supposedly changed them to 2/2, so why are they not depicted in this? Did William Barry, who was leaning towards old houses, want to make it look a little older, and he used a little artistic license to change the design? Or this view was not included in his book, The Sketches of Old Houses from 1874. So maybe when Oliver was still here is when he went, or before Oliver, he went in, and this was part of his catalog of sketches, but he never put it into the book. And it didn't get published until later in 83. So that's one of my surmises. Another reference to mosaic walks comes from Samuel Drake again in Appleton's journal. In 1874, he talks about neighboring York, Maine. Old York, lying at the extremity of the Cape, is one of the oddest places imaginable. I had to look at that several times to see whether they meant oldest places imaginable, but in fact it said oddest places imaginable. It had been lately rediscovered by those persistent pioneers, the summer tourists. It once boasted a considerable commerce. The areas belonging to the cottages are, at the proper season, aglow with lilacs, scarlet beans, and poppies, while the walks and flower beds are bordered with seashells or mosaics of beach pebbles, the marks of a seaport town. And a view from John Mees Howell's notebook from 37, which takes us through the front gate of the Lady Pepperrell House. And you can see the beach stone path here. And in the notes, it says that the broad front walk of beach stones laid in patterns was unearthed under a heavy covering of turf. So we know it at least dates back to 1883. And finally, we see a view of the second story here. So we know that this is after 1900, but before 1922, which you'll learn about in a minute. Now, another Portsmouth person of interest is Alexander Ladd of the Moffat Ladd House in Portsmouth. You know, he was an avid gardener, and this diary was discovered a number of years ago, and it dates from 1888 to 1895, and it's just chock-a-block full of all of his gardening endeavors, and it's really just a treasure trove of information. The publication, I believe, is still for sale, probably at the Moffat Ladd House. It reveals that he made weekly trips across the Piscataqua, bringing bushels of fruit from his extensive garden to dine and visit with his grandchildren and children, 4 different families who had summer houses in Kittery Point. He rowed the family rowboat called Qui Vive, which means on the alert, by his grandson Chandler. It was kept on the dock in front of Ladd's house. They also had a wherry that was said to hold 12 children. Now, anybody that's kayaked out in that water knows that the currents are pretty demanding. And to think that he went back and forth weekly, he said every Sunday he had dinner with his daughter over in Kittery Point. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, that kind of traffic pattern by boat. The family's seasonal arrival and departures were often noted in the Biddeford Times, which included Kittery news. In 1902, it was said among the summer residences that were recently opened are those of J.L. Ward and Manning Emery, who were both son-in-laws of Ladd. And this a view of the Moffat House with the famous chestnut that was said to be planted by William Whipple. And you can see, actually, this is an elm tree here. So right out in front of the house was the water. They were right on the water. And this view from Chauncey Creek, these gentlemen are from the Portsmouth Athletic Club. And it's an 1890 view that gives us a little idea of some of the traditional boats. Samuel Drake talks about how Kittery had become a tourist town. Kittery Point has become a resort during the summer months. It abounds in the materials of picturesque history. And then in the Boston Evening Transcript from 1877, an article, Paddling on the Piscataqua, about quaint old Kittery, there's plenty of antiquity and natural beauty to last in exploring more than just one tide. Going to the Pepperrell Hotel towards the sea, the tomb of the Pepperrell family, the old mansion, houses from 1 to 2 centuries old are not so very rare here. Among the oldest are the Whipple, Bray, Pepperrell, Sparhawk, and Cutts mansions. Shown here is the Champernoun Hotel that was at the end of Lawrence Lane, just around the corner from the Lady Pepperrell House and across from the church, and the Hotel Pepperrell, which was built in 1872 and was located just above where the Pepperrell tomb was. Now, the Hotel Pepperrell burned in 1950, but it's a rather interesting, I think, story about the Chamberdown Hotel, because it's a pretty cool looking building. It was demolished by John Mead Howells, who purchased the property in 1922. His intention was to create his own family property at the end of Lawrence Lane, which is what he did. And so this is a view of the demolition. I love this view. It's 1920, and it's here at the Athenaeum. And if we look up there, there's the Lady Pepperrell House. So you're looking from Spruce Creek. There's the bridge to Kittery Point. There was a toll house right over here. And it's very, very open. Now, of course, you can't see through all the trees that look up to the house. So that view is 1920 in a postcard. 1922 would be the year that William Woods would buy the Lady Pepperrell House. And he's an interesting gentleman. He was from Ohio, but he went to Phillips Exeter Academy when he was a young man. He owned a tool company, but he was also a sophisticated antique collector, specializing in glass, and you can see this auction item here. He was very interested in renovating the Lady Pepperrell House, and he would hire the summer resident, John Mead Howells, architect. He stayed in Portsmouth, according to the papers, during the renovations, and his son was attending Phillips Exeter during this time period. Howells would build north and south piazzas and attach them to the house. And these were done in 23. And you can see the additions here and then here. And then this is the view from the north side looking over. Howells' own property was just around the corner down Lawrence Lane. And this is a little later view in 1940. And then the front elevation created by Howells of the Pepperrell House, which includes a rather interesting fence. So it's said in a number of places in Howells' own writing that the fence was restored impeccably based on a drawing that was done by the mother of Stephen Decatur around the time of the Civil War. And it's difficult to see, but this is an arched entryway, and this is a pineapple. So he says that the original included the pineapple, but it was never built. So the rest of it was built. This fence with the diamond pattern in the bottom is there today. It now has urns on the post, but you can see the piazzas on either side. And then some photographs from the Charles Garish collection here at the Athenaeum. That these views are probably from the renovation through the end of the time period of the Garish photographs from 1925. And the winter scene, at least, we can see the arbor, the grape arbor here, and maybe horizontal lines here for the arbor in this view as well. Woods would only own the property for 8 years and then would sell to Virginia Hodge in 1930. She used it as a summer residence, and with Catherine Perry, opened it to the public for various endeavors. She and Catherine were both patrons of historic preservation and garden club movements. And they would eventually, in 1942, turn it over to SPNEA, or Historic New England. In the 50s, the Kittery Garden Club was contacted by Spinea to take over and help to renovate the gardens at the Lady Pepperrell House. And at the Kittery Naval Museum, there's a series of notebooks that are just very interesting. And the women that were involved in these projects were so good about documenting what they did at the property. So every bit of plant material, whether it was removed or added, you can see that they got awards for an herb garden, the border garden, and a rock garden down here. There was a rock garden, and they already in place, maybe dating more from the Howells time period, but it was renovated during this time period. And this is just an example of some of the things that they did. So they drew plans, they documented photographs with photographs. They got permission each time from SPNEA if they were going to make additions, in this case a rose garden with a pool in the center of it. And then eventually Spinea would add their own plant material through one of their staff members, Lynn Spencer, in the 1980s. And she also provided a plot plan for the changes that she made. She added grapevines to the arbor. She eliminated the rock garden altogether. Whether she added the giant junipers that are there now, I'm not certain, but these are some views from today of what we see is left, and there's our, it's not in patterns any longer, but the beachstone path is still there. And then there are some indications of some earlier times with stone line pathways. This would have eventually gone through the arbor. And then just the most curious thing, this little cemetery that's right on the property. And it takes us back to our beginnings because it belonged to the Gunniston family. And there's only 1 or 2 headstones left. But this one was Mary Gunniston, and it actually dates to 1726. And if you remember in the very beginning of my presentation, I showed that slide, and it showed the Gunniston family owning area near the church itself. So these stones still stand in the lower yard underneath the big horse chestnut. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm happy to take any questions from anyone, and maybe we'll turn the lights on again. Thank you. I've exhausted you, I'm sure. Yeah.
Are there different spellings for pepperell?
It's always 2 R's, 2 E's, 2 L's. People spell it wrong, but it's supposed to have 2 R's, 2 L's. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes.
Simple one, is the house open to the public at all?
It's not, because it went into private hands in the 80s, and it's been in private hands since. There was a covenant, and there still are covenants on what can be done at the property through Historic New England. And for many, many years, it was required that it be open to the public. I think it's only one day a year. But that covenant has ended, and so that's not required. It was most recently, I would say 2 years ago, part of a garden club tour. So there is an occasion. But what's interesting actually now is that the current owners are interested in bringing back some of the features from the Howells time period and focus on that as a time period that they would like to. And so they're actually putting the North Piazza back on. Yeah, yeah. Yes,
When was that North Piazza taken down, you know?
that's a good question. I'm not certain.
Joe Frost did it.
Joe Frost did it?
What was
Huh.
the year on that?
I think that'd be in the
In the 60s? Huh. It's like street trees. Things come around and. Yes.
Talk a little bit more about the summer house tradition. I'm familiar with it.
Okay. Well, we can see how many times they were mentioned in 18th century gardens, but they're all over the place in 19th century gardens as well. But I think the most distinguishing difference between the two is that they were real rooms in the 18th century and had the purpose of spending time. So the man of the house would bring his friends out. They would play games of some sort in there. I'm sure a lot of drinking took place, but they were often positioned, and in both cases, positioned with some view in mind. So it would be at a key point in a formal garden at the end of a pathway on a rise so that you would have a view out of it. And so the owners and I have talked about where something like that could go. And their lower yard is on the other side of the grape arbor, I think would lend itself very nicely. And it would be great because the trees have come in and blocked their view of the water entirely. So you don't really get that sense. And a summer house would lift you up so that you could see out to it. The ones in the 19th century were much more lattice based, so open air. So people weren't quite as afraid of nature, and they'd go and sit outside and actually enjoy themselves. So the 19th century summer house was quite different. Tom.
Just a comment that William Baird's sketchbooks, which are at the Frick store, go back to 1863.
Oh, really? Oh,
Somewhere I've got digital images of the Decatur sketches.
you do? Tom, I never knew.
Didn't ask.
That's very interesting. Huh. Well, I was never, there was one piece of information that I never was able to find, and that as part of the Howells work in 23, there were supposedly not only that house elevation, but there was a plot plan. And Spinea can't find it. It's referred to several times, and it might have documented when that grape arbor came in and some other probably key features. But I've never been able to find it. So, yes.
Do the more solid 18th century summer houses have any influence from British landscape?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
So would you say that current owners are trying to restore the garden to the 1920s approximately time period?
That seems to be an interest of theirs at the moment, more the colonial revival.
Yeah.
time period. So plant material would follow that as well. A lot of perennials from grandmother's gardens, foxgloves and larkspurs and plants like that, peonies and roses and